Deeply, as the dreams seem to drown away his very sanity, he recognizes his father's powerful grip, pulls him back from the brink, back to reality, back to the safety of his room. Finally, his fever breaks. Weaker than a new kitten, his mother hovers over him, feeding him water and bread soaked in milk. He's completely embarrassed that he can't even go to the bathroom by himself. She laughs away his embarrassment, telling him that this wasn't the first time she had done this for him. He passes back into darkness, too weak to argue or explain. As he lay in bed, too weak to move but not tired enough to sleep, he could hear his father and two younger sisters clattering through the back door. They were filling 5-gallon buckets with snow from the drifts outside and bringing them inside. The water had to be melted pot by pot on the big wood stove, then it was carried out to the horses. His mother, tucked into a quilt, was sleeping on the floor beside his bed. All along the walls, scorch marks were streaked across the room. The shelf that used to hold his action figures, cap guns, and precious coonskin cap was singed and bare. Apparently he'd burnt them all in one of his fever rages. A wet blanket and a couple of buckets of water stood ready to put any other fires out. Trying to work enough moisture into his parched mouth, he hissed as his youngest sister came back from outside. "Letty!" He heard her steps pause by the door, so he repeated his soft call. She stuck her head cautiously through the door. "What?" she whispered. Chris looked at his mother, but she was out, sleeping the deep sleep of exhaustion. "Can I have some of that?" Letty nodded, but said, "Just give me a minute, and I'll get you a cup of water." Chris tucked his blankets close about himself. "No, the snow will be fine. It'll be nice and cool." She shrugged, and, careful to be quiet, brought one of the buckets into his room. She put it next to him, and he reached down and scooped some of the snow out into his hand. It felt good on his palm. Rolling on his side, he ate it, working it around his dry mouth. "How are things outside?" She grimaced. "Not good. The storm knocked out the power, so there's no water in the tanks. The trucks won't start. The calves got out. It was blowing so hard." Chris opened his eyes fully. "They got out? How?" She tucked a few strands of her dark brown hair under her thick stocking cap. "When the storm started, we put them in the hay pen. Dad said they'd have shelter and be able to get plenty of feed there, but the storm made drifts rise higher than the fence. Dad said they just walked out." Chris cursed under his breath. "And the pickups? Are there any of them starting yet?" She only shook her head. Then she added, "And the horses, still weak. None of them are standing on steady legs this morning. It was really cold, like 50 below. Dad says if we tried to ride them and find the calves, they wouldn't be able to make it, especially with the snow being so deep." Chris took another handful of snow from the bucket and worked it over his throbbing brow. Across his cheeks as well, the skin was swollen and stinging. Letty took a jar of salve from his nightstand and opened it for him, but he only shook his head. The icy flakes felt better than the ointment. "Is there another girl here?" As he'd lain in his bed, he'd been able to hear the voices of his father and two sisters, of course, but there'd been another one, a stranger's voice as well. Letty looked toward the kitchen and living room, scowling. "Has she been in here? Did she bother you? Dad told her to stay in the living room, keep melting the snow on the wood stove." Chris shook his head and hissed for Letty to quiet down. With a nod, he indicated their sleeping mother. Letty made an abashed face, then she whispered, "That's Kaylee Latham. She came down from Great Falls to spend Christmas here. I guess Moonlight Meskai is her grandfather." Chris couldn't help but give a brittle smile. Moonlight was their neighbor, not quite 4 miles down the road. But he was not necessarily a good neighbor. His little place, no more than an acre of sagebrush and soapweed sporting an old RV, was filled with trash. He'd made it plain he had no interest in building any connection with any of the people around Grass Creek. Probably because the only thing on his place in halfway decent shape was the large patch of marijuana that grew behind the RV. Letty continued, "She wants us to take her over there right now. Right now. This moment, like we ain't got nothing else that might be need to take care of. No matter that nothing is running, her little car broke down just over the hill, and it's not running either. Dad's already gone and checked, but she thinks that we have to drop everything and get her to her family." Her gesture took in everything in and outside the house. "We are a little busy here." Glance at the unseen girl in the living room, she said, "She's an influencer, and she's already threatened to..." She paused to make air quotes, Expose Dad and how mean he is. Chris chuckled quietly. Good luck with that, he said. Quieting down, she shyly took Chris's hand and turned it this way and that, examining it. Wow, I saw you. You had fire coming from these in such huge blasts, like you were in some kind of video game. And your eyes were red, like glowing red. It was crazy. Then she added, do you think you can still do that? With a significant look, she indicated the bucket beside him. He tilted his head and let his hand fall on the ice in the bucket. He closed his eyes and tried to remember what he'd done while fighting all those demons of his dreams. All of a sudden, the ice in the bucket erupted under his hand, spraying him and Letty with cold particles. Quickly, he took his hand away. Letty jumped back and ran for the wet blanket, but before she could throw it over him, he said, No, it's all right. I got this. The sound of the bucket jumping and Letty's rush for the blanket had woken their mother, though. She jerked awake and scrambled to Chris's side. Hon, she said softly. Easy now, easy. As she rushed to his side, she tried bringing the wet blanket with her. Not finding it in its spot, she finally noticed Letty standing next to Chris's bed. What the hell? As their mother straightened, Letty shrank back while Chris said, Mom, I'm all right. His mother and sister watched. He carefully laid his hand on the ice again. This time, fire didn't erupt from his hand, but began to melt the contents of the bucket. He continued to feed a steady stream until all the ice was melted, but the water level was so low in the bucket that he couldn't reach it anymore. His small line of flames continued to burn from his hand, threatening to melt the plastic bucket. He grunted in distress. I don't know how to shut it off. Quickly, Letty got the other bucket from outside the door and placed it beside him. His fire streamed in spurts and blasts, scattering the little clumps of snow. But then he figured out how to make it smooth, and soon the second bucket had melted to about a gallon of water. His mother took the wet blanket and wrapped it around his hand. The familiar action triggered a memory in him, and he managed to shut his fire away. He nodded his thanks and brought his hand to his chest. Suddenly he was exhausted. He heard his mother scolding Letty as he lost himself in sleep. When Chris woke again, he didn't really know how much later it was. For all he knew, he could have slept the whole day and the entire night. As he lay in his bed, he heard his mother and his sisters talking to their visitor. The newcomer's voice was rising with her agitation, as Chris could clearly hear her say, Why can't you cook me a hamburger? I don't feel like a half-heated burrito right now. Chris had expected his mother to reply with some no doubt cutting remark, but instead he heard Ada's voice. Kayla, the top of the stove is full. We have to melt all that water for the horses. The only thing we have room for is the burritos. He heard his mother's voice, but it was pitched too low for him to catch. He chuckled when he heard Letty suggest the girl could make herself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. The resulting explosion was as comical as it was expected. If you think I want to put all those processed poisons into my body, you're crazy. I wouldn't eat peanut butter or that stuff you have in the cupboard labeled jelly if my life depended on it. Besides, I'm gluten intolerant. I can't eat bread. Ada answered, A hamburger has bread with it. Why would you ask for a hamburger if you don't want to eat bread? If there are beef, tomatoes, and onions with it, the bread doesn't bother me so much. Is that too much to ask? Just a little hamburger. It won't take no time to cook it all. Then, for a moment, Chris couldn't tell who that girl was talking to as she said, I'm an unwilling guest in this house. The ranchers who live here have not made me welcome. They seem to be trying to make me angry over the very simplest things. Chris heard loud banging noises and then, let me show you what they have in their cupboards. Nothing but garbage. Preservative, gluten, packaged, processed poison, pre-cooked and full of toxins. At each exclamation, he could hear the small bang of some item being tossed on the counter. Now, his mother's voice was loud and clear as she said, Kaylee, I have told you before, you don't have permission to record anything inside this house. Now you will put those groceries back in the cupboards just the way they were, or you won't get anything to eat at all. Wait, what? Was the visitor recording on her cell phone? That would mean the Wi-Fi is working, but That could only be if the electricity had come back. If that was true, why would they still heat water for the horses on the wood stove? The well and water supply would be working. Once again, through the thin walls of the trailer house, he could hear the girl's voice. Can you see how I'm being treated? Like I'm some kind of criminal just because my car broke down beside their driveway. His mother's voice was steady and firm. You are welcome to leave any time you want. As a matter of fact, why don't you get your stylish little black boots on? Here's your coat, grab your hat, go down to the end of the driveway, turn left, and keep going for about 4 miles. Your grandpa's house is at that turnoff. Can't miss it. The girl's voice rose again. I can't walk through all that snow in the middle of a storm, and you know it. Then her voice changed slightly, and she added, These people want to make me walk through the deserted countryside. We are in the middle of one of the worst storms of the century, but they don't care. They just don't want to be bothered. With a look past the tattered remains of the curtains, Chris looked outside. It seemed to be a brilliant early Wyoming afternoon. The sun was glistening brightly, reflected off the thick whiteness that blanketed the rocks and sage. His mother's voice answered, Then you better come here and eat this burrito. She paused and then added, After you put all those groceries back in the cupboards. At the top of her lungs, the girl shrieked, I don't want a burrito! I want a hamburger! Abruptly, he heard her voice take on a note of fear. Don't touch me. You can't do that. Give that back. That's my property. The bumps and knocks of a scuffle could be heard next, along with a noticeable squeak of the front door being opened. Then, after another loud screech from the girl, he could hear the distinct sound of the front door slamming shut. While Ada and Letty both made odd exclamations, he raised his arms. He thought he might be a little stronger than he'd been earlier. He heaved himself up on his elbows and worked his legs off the side of the bed. Out in the living room, he could hear his mother tell Ada to get their dad. We might need him. Besides, he's going to be pissed if he misses all this. There was a brief silence, but then Letty began to giggle. As Ada ran past Chris's door and out through the back porch, he heard her chuckling softly to herself. In the meantime, he stumbled to his dresser. Taking out underwear, sweats, and a hoodie, he began to dress. It was slow going, as he had to rest often, but he eventually succeeded and tottered his way down the short hallway. At the kitchen table, he slid gratefully into a chair. Neither Letty nor his mother noticed his arrival. They were kneeling on the couch. The living room window behind it was almost completely covered by frost, yet they both peered at the small, clear spot in the middle. His mother said, Warmer, almost. Nope. Cold, colder. The warmth of the wood stove, along with plenty of humidity from the warming pans crowded on its surface, enveloped him. Taking a deep breath, he sat back in the chair, finding the most restful position. At the window, Letty gasped, Oh, she's got it now. Then she giggled. Although she had left her chore coats on the front porch, she still wore her stocking cap, her hair escaping around its edges. Of the 3 Richter kids, she looked most like their father, with her dark hair and brilliant blue eyes. Chris's mother jumped off the couch and hustled to get their visitor's coat from the little pallet that was laid out in a corner of the room. As she grabbed it, she saw Chris and gave him a reassuring smile. Then she opened the front door, threw the bright pink nylon garment outside, and shut the door again. Only moments later, a big thump could be heard against the door, followed by frantic pounding. Chris's mother opened the door to the smallest slit. The stranger threw herself uselessly against it, but holding the door fast, Chris's mother said, Here's the deal. You can come back inside, but you have to put all that stuff back into the cupboards. We fixed you a burrito. Eat it if you want to. But that is all you're getting right now. And you will quit acting like you're videoing everything. Your phone is not working any more than ours are. So quit the big performance. Still holding the door, she said, Is that a deal? Their visitor stood outside the door, leaning her head against the door jamb. She shivered in the cold Wyoming wind. The The bare hands she'd used to dig through the snowdrift to find her phone were folded together tightly. She panted in deep gasps. "Yes, whatever you want. It's so cold out here, please. Just let me in." Chris's mother allowed the door to open and stepped back. Kaylee rushed in to stand before the stove, holding her chilled red hands against its warmth. Shivering from head to toe, she cast furtive looks at Chris's mother, at Letty, and then at Chris. On the back porch, Ada and her father stopped to stomp the snow off their boots, then entered the big combined kitchen and living room. As he passed by, Chris's father laid a hand on Chris's shoulder, while the stock dog slipped under the table and lay down. Ada took a seat beside Chris, making a mock grimace. Just over 6 feet tall and heavily built from a lifetime of work, Chris's father stopped and asked, "Mackenzie, what do you need?" Chris's mother said, "Nothing yet, Bruce. Miss Latham here tells me that she's willing to treat us and our home with respect." She leaned in to give the influencer girl a meaningful look. "Right?" Still huddled close to the stove, Kaylee nodded her head sharply. Chris's mother said, "And now, seeing you've been acting like a total jackass, you're going to clean up the mess you made on my counters, right?" Beside Chris, Ada made a low sound. Chris tried to keep the smile from his face. The three siblings had heard that tone from their mother many times. Miss Kaylee was about to get an exercise in humility. Chris's mother added, "Now?" Kaylee looked up with wounded eyes. "But I'm still so cold. My hands are frozen." Chris's mother stepped back and swept an inviting arm toward the kitchen counters. "They'll warm up." Kaylee turned towards Chris's mother. "You can't order me around like that." Chris's mother shook her head, her brown eyes flashing. "Clean up the mess you made, or else leave this house and never come back." The girl made an inarticulate sound and, with both hands, swept everything off the top of the stove. "No, I won't!" Pots clattered everywhere and melted snow water gushed all over the floor. "I don't want to eat that shit from the cupboards. You can pick that poison up." With a frustrated growl, Chris's father leapt forward. "God damn it, girl!" He took her around her waist and lifted her. She cried out and flailed in his grip, her legs and arms striking at anything in reach. Chris's mother threw open the front door. The dogs, spooked by the commotion, ran speedily out into the cold day. Letty made a small, frightened squeak as Kaylee briefly got a hold of her hoodie, but Chris's father inexorably carried the stranger outside and threw her down the steps. "We needed that water, you miserable bitch." Chris could hear the girl protesting as his father followed her into the ranch yard. Ada jumped up and rushed to the living room window. Chris would have loved to be able to follow her, but he didn't trust himself to be able to make it much past the kitchen table. From her spot by the window, Ada looked back at Chris and said, "He's got her again. He's carrying her down the driveway." Chris's mother rushed around the living room and gathered up Kaylee's belongings. Stylish leather boots, a beige purse, pretty white gloves, and a couple of blankets from the girl's pallet were gathered up and thrown into a pile on the couch. Then his mother retrieved her boots from the back porch. "God damn it, look at this mess." Stepping over the large puddles of spilt water and icy slush, she fastened her laces, gathering up the bundle, and hurried after their father. By the screeches that could be heard, the occasional deep rumbling of his father's voice, and the two ranch dogs barking, Chris figured his father was making a good progress down their long driveway. Letty, looking out the living room window beside Ada, winced. "Oh, she got him a good one there." Ada nodded. "That's gonna leave a bruise." Then Letty said, "He's dragging her by the arm now, right through all that snow." Ada added, "She's up again. I guess she didn't like all that snow inside her clothes." After a few moments, she added, "Mama's helping him drag her across the cattle guard." Chris leaned back in his seat. He dearly wished he could see this. Lady said, "She's still fighting. Dad's holding her while Ma's getting the car open. They're stuffing her in the car now." Chris could no longer hear his parents' voices. "What kind of car is it?" he asked. Ada answered, "Hard to tell with all that snow on it. Some kind of little white Mazda thing?"
Then his littlest sister said, "They got her in it. Ma's throwing her stuff in." Ada continued, "And now he's giving her a lecture. The little car is rocking. She's throwing an epic hissy fit inside it." She turned to look at Chris, her dark brown eyes sparkling and her white teeth flashing in a wicked grin. They were all three very familiar with Dad's finger-pointed lectures, and apparently the two girls were very tired of the influencer girl's behavior. She must have made everyone's life miserable over the preceding snowbound days. Letty, so similar to her older sister, yet darker like their father, walked to the counter to check the phones that were laid out on it. One by one, she tested all the devices. None lit up, of course, and she gave a disappointed sigh. "I'm just glad that her phone wasn't working. She'd managed to record all that, even a little bit. Ma and Dad'd be going to jail for years." Ada turned on her to ask, "What were we supposed to do? Just let some city girl come in here and wreck our home? All because she didn't want a burrito?" Letty turned to sit down on the couch. Her stockinged feet briefly touched the wet-soaked floor, and she pulled them up under her. "That's the way it is. Just like school. The bad kids get to do what they want. I got Abel Latchert riding my ass all the time, and the moment I fight back, I'm the one in detention." She pulled her elbows in close, sticking her hands in the pocket of her black hoodie. Even as tired as he was, her words made him bristle. She was 6 years younger than him, so they'd never been in school together, but it was still hard to see his sister made into a helpless victim by the very people who were supposed to protect her from boys like that. "I'll tell you what, sis. When the weather gets better, you and me, we'll ride down to town and find that little punk. We'll teach him that messing with the Richters is not a good idea." The smile that crossed her face was tinged with disillusion. She didn't believe that he would. He made a fist and shook it. "I'm your big brother. That's the one thing big brothers are good for." She shook her head, swiping bits of brown hair away from her face. "You'll just get in trouble." Chris's gesture took in the dark kitchen light, the line of dead phones sitting beside the charging station on the counter, and the many upended kettles scattered around the living room floor. "I don't think so. Where things were, that's gone. For good." Casting a significant look out the living room window at the scene that had just played out moments before, he added, This is what it's going to be now. We go forward from here." Ada stepped back from the living room window, began picking up the scattered pots. "If that's true, I'll be glad. The way things were was so unfair." The sound of their parents stopping snow off their boots beside the front door sent Letty out to help Ada. But when their parents entered, Chris's mother said, "Leave it. That girl can't stay out there. Her clothes are covered in snow. When that melts against her, she'll freeze to death. If she doesn't come back on her own, we'll have to go down there and get her. She can clean up her own mess then." Chris's father grimaced and shook his head. "Sorry, Kenny, that won't work. I need water for the nags. If I want to use them to find the yearlings tomorrow, they'll need a solid bait of grain tonight. For that, I'll have to get a good drink first." Chris's mother nodded. While the horses could get by licking snow, it would not be enough to allow them to digest a heavy grain ration. They'd colic or even founder. Quickly, the pots were returned to the stove and filled with snow from the 5-gallon buckets. Since almost all the towels and some of the blankets had been soiled during Chris's fever, extra clothes were brought from their closets to clean up the wet floor. Since the washer and dryer weren't working, Chris's mother had them store the soppy pile inside a shed. As the living room was cleared up, Chris managed to get himself a glass of milk and a thick chunk of roast beef from the fridge. In the barely cold appliance, the milk was just on the edge of turning. Casting a look out the living room window, Chris's father scratched his thick black beard. "I took that extra oil drum, put it in the horse tank, built a fire inside it. It's melting some water, but the tank's frozen plumb solid. Melted water just runs under the ice. Need to go back out and chip some of the ice so the horses can get at it." He pointed a work-hardened hand at the little car on the blacktop road. "If that girl moves, call me immediately." Chris squared his shoulders and shook his head. "Dad, I can probably help you with that tank." He lifted his hands and waggled his fingers. His father only laughed. "You? No, No, wait. You're having a hard time holding your head up. If I take you out there in that cold, you'll be back to fevering before evening. Your mother will have my hide." He turned to go back outside and laid a hand on Chris's shoulder as he passed by. "Well, thanks, bud. We'll see what you look like tomorrow." During the night, Chris had another one of those dreams. This one was full of dire warnings and predictions rather than terrifying carnage. Wolves and bears, along with lions and hyenas, had been sitting high on a ridge, looking down at a tribe of humans walking below. They seemed to be laughing with each other, much the same as the terrifying shapes of the first dreams. They had been slavering, salivating about the humans who were so vulnerable below them. And when they flowed off the ridge and onto the brush-covered flat, 5 humans stepped forward to meet them. Other animals were by the humans' side. A dog accompanied one, while a huge bull sided another. A third rode a magnificent long-maned black horse, and the final 2 Tarins were also sided by 4-legged companions, although Chris did not recognize what they were. Somewhere deep down, he knew he was dreaming, and didn't want to wield the fire from his hands. He needed to wake up. As he steeled himself to stay calm and not be caught up, he saw one of the Tarins look up at him. Their eyes caught, and Chris clearly saw as the young man mouthed, "What the hell?" while raising his hands. Fire burst forth, heading straight towards Chris's face. As he jerked up his hands to shield himself from the imminent blast, Chris woke. Sitting upright in bed, his breath came in harsh gasps. He looked down at his mother, still sleeping on her pallet beside his bed. His thrashing hadn't woken her, and he breathed a sigh of relief. He sunk back into his pillow. The night was pitch black and still. He doubted he could get more sleep tonight, but there was nothing to be done about it. There would be no little lamp to turn on so he could read. There'd be no phone to play a couple of games on. He tucked down into his blankets and tried to still his mind. The next day, very early, everyone except for Chris prepared to spend a long day looking for their missing yearlings. The horses had been fed and watered well and had spent a night resting up. The morning dawned with a spectacular sunrise. Purple, orange, and blue were mixed together in vivid layers. There was not a cloud in the sky. Still, every person in the house checked their phone. Everyone knew how fickle the weather in Wyoming could be. Keeping a close eye on the weather reports was part of a routine nowadays, but the devices were still dead. There would be no weather forecast to check today. The plan was that Ada and their mother would search the ridges to the south from west to east. Letty and their father would take the visitor to the grandfathers and then go on to search the valley from east to the west. Chris was to be left alone in the house. He was much stronger, but not up to riding for an entire day. Even though he hadn't had another uncontrollable episode for more than 36 hours, he could tell his mother was worried about leaving him alone. Kaylee's own pink fur fringe coat and thin black leather boots would not do, so Kaylee had been given several worn-out coats and an extra set of coveralls. Chris really couldn't fault her for the expression of distaste, as he would not have liked putting the old dirt-stained garments on any better. She protested that she didn't know how to ride, but Letty assured her that good old Corey would take good care of her. She began practiced routine of protest. Chris's father's response was delivered with contained finality. Either she would ride to her grandfather's on Chloe's back, or she would walk. Either way, he added, she was leaving the Richter's home today. The girl opened her mouth defiantly, but at their father's raised black eyebrow, she followed Letty out the back door without another word. Using the tailgate of the pickup, Letty managed to get the city girl into the saddle. When his father came into the house to retrieve the rifles, the .223 Remington for his mother, and his own Winchester Featherlight 700, a feeling of unease rose inside Chris. There was something wrong, but he couldn't say what was so alarming. He looked out the window again, but every person seemed to be getting along just fine. Still, a weird foreboding filled him. Rifles in hand, his father passed by him and gave him a reassuring grin. He must have noticed Chris's expression because he paused to say, "What?" Unbidden, Chris's eyes drifted to the rifles, but he still could not say why he was suddenly worried. He shrugged self-consciously. His father smiled. "Well, have a good day, son. Try not to burn the house down, all right? Eventually, the 5 riders made their way through the yard. The 2 stock dogs cheerfully fell in with them. Chris went to the living room window to watch their progress. The ranch pickups in front of the trailer house and their father's semi were covered with a thick layer of snow, drifts trailing far into the yard. The riders had to edge along the fence to avoid them. They headed down towards the small gate beside the cattle guard at the blacktop road. It was thickly covered in snow as well, its outlines almost indistinguishable in the bright sunlight. When the riders disappeared from his view, Chris walked around the house for a while. He still couldn't place the cause of his worry. Something was wrong. What was it? He cleaned the ashes out of the big stove and dumped them outside. Then he filled the sink with water for the morning dishes. When he used his fire to warm the water, he thought wryly that he better not ever let his mother find out that he could do that. He'd be doing dishes for the rest of his life. All of a sudden, he remembered the fire-wielding Tarin in his dream. The people of the tribe had been dressed in modern clothes. The handcarts that had transported their belongings were made with bicycle tires. The wagon that a team of horses had pulled was obviously a car converted to the purpose. Yet there had not been a rifle amongst them, no firearms at all. The Tarins had stepped forward to wield their powers inside of them, but the others had only held bows or wicked-looking, long-handled clubs. He turned on his heel and ran back to the porch. He was only dressed in sweats and a hoodie, but it would have to do. He pulled on his coveralls, chore coats, and boots. When he rushed off the steep steps, his heart thumping, and cleared the corner of the house, he saw 3 wolves trotting down the ridge to the east and into the horse pasture. When they crossed the driveway, the tracks his family had left caught their interest. Nose to the snow, they followed the plainly visible trail. Chris recognized the biggest one, a gray male with black points on his nose and tail. Been seen around the area often, threatening livestock. And now he seemed to have no interest in the horses in the corral, but turned to follow the riders' tracks. At the cattle guard, the 3 predators stopped for a moment, nosing around alertly. Then the leader turned east with a purposeful trot. The other 2 quickly followed. Chris cursed. The wind was beginning to come hard from the east, and the wolves hadn't noticed him at all. He grabbed a halter and hurried to the corral. The horses were dozing in the sun and spooked when he ran towards them. But of his 2 horses, Sour Patch was the fleeter, better traveling horse. But the sorry moron would not settle to allow himself to be caught. Chris, feeling the effects of his fever, almost gave up. He could catch the wiser but less agile Dumbledore. Eventually, the older gelding allowed Chris to slip past him and pulled a halter on Sour Patch. Once the dark bay was haltered, Chris had no choice but to lean on the fence till his knees quit shaking. Several precious moments later, he hurried to saddle, but then had to rest again before he could find the strength to mount. Before heading out, he rode to the woodpile at the back of the house. Leaning from the saddle, he pulled the axe out of the splitting log. When he put the horse in a lope, he was dismayed at how hard his mount struggled in the deep snow. Even on the smooth blacktop, each stride had to become a small jump. He turned east in the direction his father and Letty and Kaylee had taken. Snow flew up in small cloud of icy bits as his horse found a semblance of a stride. Soon, only Sour Patch's steady huffs and the crunching of each running jump could be heard over the wind leaning against them. Looking at the tracks on the snow before him, he knew that the wolves were indeed following the riders. When he came to the spot where the Moonlight McSky's little dilapidated RV came into view, his breath caught in his throat. In the little parking area before the RV, next to 2 drifted-over cars, his father and sister were still aboard their horses. Kaylee, however, was on the ground, screaming and struggling to stay on her feet. They were encircled not by 3, but 9 streaking gray predators. The whole pack. His father and his sister were allowing their mounts to kick and bite at the ones who darted in to strike. His father wheeled about, using the rifle as a club. He struck down a lighter-shaded one that jumped for Rollo's throat. Another wolf found an opening and lunged at Kaylee, but Bruce swung the rifle low and managed to block it. Letty clung to Shaky's back, one hand on the saddle horn, as her mount bit and kicked at the attackers. Chris used the ends of his reins to drive Sour Patch ruthlessly down into the deep snow and through the open gate beside the cattle guard. The big brown gelding's breath came in steady but labored bellows now. Chris spurred him on, up the hill toward the riders fighting for their lives. He called his Tarin close, up through the core of him. When the line of blistered marks across his brow and cheeks began to be painfully sore, he called more. He would need it all. As Sour Patch continued to lunge up the snowy incline, Chris extended his hand. He threw a ball of fire at the closest wolf. The thick-furred predator was enveloped in a fiery blaze, shrieking his pain and fright as he turned and fled. Quickly changing his target, Chris picked off another. Again, the wolf howled harshly as the ball of fire blazed across it. Falling to the snow, it whined pitifully as it tried to crawl away. But Chris had no sympathy to spare. The power running through him felt immense. He roared, the vastness of the mountains in his voice, and he threw another fireball at another large male. His good, dark gelding carried him bravely to join the others, even as another wolf jetted across his way and lunged for his throat. Chris laughed now as his fire made a thin, concentrated line, shearing the leaping apex predator almost in half. Sour Patch rose and struck the ruined carcass with his unyielding front hooves, driving it into the snow. The black-nosed male circled around once more, intelligent yellow eyes taking in Chris's lifted hand. With a few low growls and huffs, he called the rest of his pack to him. Rather than circling and milling as they had done before, his packmates came to him alertly, obediently. Beside Chris, Bruce said, "What the hell?" The horses nickered to each other, glad to be joined together. Kaylee stood on her feet, favoring one leg, screaming in shrill bursts of panic. Letty still clung to Shakey's back. She cried in soft whimpers as she bent down and put a foot back in the stirrup. Chris spurred his reluctant gelding forward, pointing a hand at the large pack leader. The cunning canine was well out of his range. Nevertheless, Chris released a large ball of fire to tumble toward him, exulting in the power that coursed through him, from him. The wolf, his sleek sides heaving with each open-jawed breath, sat on his haunches and watched the fireball tumble ineffectually through the sagebrush. For a long moment he held Chris's gaze. Then, with an unseen signal to his remaining pack, he led them up the ridge and into the snow-covered sage. Chris's father roared as the pack turned away. "Yeah, that's right. You better run. Run home to Mommy. Tell her where you got that new haircut." With a growl, he spurred Rollo up the ridge and shook his weapon at their retreating forms. With the wolves gone, Chris asked, "Where are the dogs, Dad?" "They went with Ada and Ma, son. They are safe." Then his father sidled his horse close to Letty's and laid a hand on her shoulder. "You all right, Ladybug?" At her curt nod, he gave her a hug, leaning far from his horse. She clung to him for a minute, her shoulders shaking as she cried quietly. Kaylee, still screaming in shrill bursts, sank to the ground. Then, whimpering in hiccups and moans, she crawled through the snow toward one of the little cars. She made her way over a hard-packed drift. When she could reach the passenger window, she scraped the snow and ice from it with her bared hands. Having worked a small clearing out of it, she began to sob. No, no, no. Chris sidled his gelding closer to peer through the little cleared spot. 3 people were seated in the little sedan. An older white man sporting a heavy mane of dreadlocks, and 2 middle-aged black-haired women. They sat huddled together, all 3 sharing the back seat. In death, their faces were so pale as to appear white. "Damn," Chris stammered. What? Why did they try to shelter in the car?" His father came up beside him to also peer into the vehicle. "Because the storm took the roof off their trailer." Only when Chris turned to look at the old RV did he realize his father was right. The roof was gone, and the insides of the van were totally filled with snow. A bent stovepipe stuck up like a lone sentinel, and loose curtains fluttered forlornly in the Wyoming breeze. The 3 occupants had taken shelter in their car, no doubt thinking they'd be able to drive to town, But, like the Richter's ranch pickups, Moonlight McSky's vehicle had not worked either. The small vessel had become their crypt as the temperatures plummeted to 50 below. Chris shook his head. It was a shame. He hadn't liked Moonlight, but he wouldn't have wished that fate on anyone. When his father rode close and took in the gruesome scene, Chris said, "Dad, you have to ride after Ada and Ma." He took the axe out of his rope ties and handed it to his father. "I can't go. Sour Patch is done." He gestured at his horse. Each heavy breath rocked him as he sat in the saddle. "You need to bring them back. The guns don't work anymore, and the pack's not done. They might go after Ma and Ada next." His father fixed Chris with an intense stare. "Explain," he snapped. Chris gestured at the general direction that would be his mother's and Ada's path. "Your rifle didn't misfire or jam. It doesn't work anymore. None of the firearms do." His voice rose with his urgency. "My dreams, Dad, that's what they say." Then he indicated the dead wolves on the ground. "And they also say that wolves and such will now be hunting humans. They'll be driven to it. They'll hunt humans before they'll go after anything else." He paused, waiting for his father to connect the dots. But when his father began to object, Chris allowed his Tarin to rise again. "We don't have time for this. They might be in danger even now." His brow and cheeks stung, and he knew his eyes glowed red. He lifted his hand towards his father. "Give me Rolo. I'll ride after them, and you can take Sour Patch home." His father gaped at him incredulously. Chris himself couldn't believe he was actually threatening his father, his own father. But Ada and Ma had to be found and brought home. Immediately. They could not be out here without any way to defend themselves. Just as he opened his mouth to repeat his words, his father nodded curtly. He turned his horse smoothly and kicked the big red bay into a long trot. Over his shoulder, he called to Letty, telling her to go home with Chris. Kaylee began to scream. "No, Bruce! Don't leave us with him! He's a monster! Don't leave me! Bruce!" Chris's father had found a gate to go through. He would go cross-country, crossing the Grass Creek Valley as fast as possible. Chris was glad his father had listened to him. He knew he didn't have enough strength in him to deal with opening and closing pasture gates he would find. He called after his father, "And warn people when you see them." His father acknowledged the message with a wave of his hand. Looking around the small yard, Chris counted 4 dead wolves. He'd killed 3 with his fire. His father had clubbed the last one with a rifle. He had to fight to get a triumphant grin off his face. There was the one that had lunged for Sour Patch's throat, the one he'd almost sheared in half with all that fantastic power. He'd loved the feel of the Tarin flying from his hands. Now the carcass lay in the snow, almost in 2 pieces, little lines of smoke rising from its fur. Part of him felt like he'd found a deeper purpose to his life, to protect those he loved, to wield the Tarin he'd been given. His elation was a sharp contrast to the grief Kaylee voiced. When he dismounted to help Kaylee get on Clory, he wondered if there was more wolves out there, but he thought it unlikely. The pack had been 9 strong. That was almost more than this sparse country could support. If there were any more, they'd have to have fled Yellowstone in droves after the storm. Another thing he found unlikely. The storm would have killed plenty of elk, antelope, and bison, giving the wolves in the park plenty to eat. Undoubtedly, they would soon come after the humans in the lower elevations, but for now, he thought they and the folks on the creek would only have to contend with the 5 wolves who were left of this local pack. With Kaylee mounted again, he led the way out of the McSky's place. She wanted him to carry her dead loved ones with him, but the bodies would be safe inside that car until they could be properly buried. So he didn't even acknowledge her tearful demands. While his frantic run had taken him to the McSky's place in little more than 10 minutes, their slow walk back took almost an hour. The brilliant Wyoming sun warmed the morning till Chris thought of shedding one of his coats, but he knew it only seemed warm. The wind would let him know how cold it actually was with every small gust. He found he was too tired to respond to Letty's marveling over his fire. Eventually, his sister let him be and turned to comforting Kaylee. When they arrived home, no dogs came out to greet them, indicating their parents and Ada had not returned yet. When they dismounted at the saddle shed, Letty said, "Go on inside, bro. I can tell you're dead on your feet. I'll take care of Sour Patch." Chris thanked her, and with shaking knees climbed the steep stairs back to the porch. Unbidden, Kaylee followed him. He was about to tell her to help Letty, but his sister gestured him to silence. Inside, the girl went straight into the kitchen, trailing little bits of snow and ice from her boots. When Chris got his outside clothes off on the back porch, he could hear her begin speaking. When he followed inward, he found her seated at the kitchen table, her pink phone propped up before her. Tearfully, she told the lifeless black screen about losing her mother, aunt, and her grandfather. He shook his head but left her alone. He helped himself to some breakfast leftovers, pancakes and sausage, then went to his room to eat them. From his desk chair, he could watch Letty out the back window there. He hated not being able to help her, but she'd grown quite a bit since last summer, and she handled the 3 horses easily. After a while, the crying in the kitchen changed to a horrified account of how Chris had killed the wolves. He shook his head as the influencer girl bemoaned the loss of the beautiful creatures. It was odd to hear his actions described as monstrous atrocities. He rubbed a hand over the line of blisters above his brow. He'd used the power Freymatuk had given him to protect those that were his. Even thinking about that morning's events, he exulted over the feelings of power, wonder, and triumph that came. He lifted his hand and let a small ball of fire rise above his palm. The flow of the power through his core and out his arm felt amazing. He shook his head in chagrin. He should have warmed his breakfast like that rather than eating cold, syrupy pancakes. He let the fire return to him and went back to watching over Letty as she tried to brush Sour Patch's coat dry. Bruce, Mackenzie, and Ada returned. Chris had fallen asleep on the keyboard of his computer. The voices outside the window woke him. As he watched the activity outside, he realized only Ada and their mother put their saddles away. His father changed saddles to his roan mare, Creed, and Ada soon returned from the corral, leading Dumbledore. His mother came inside, spoke a few words to Letty and Kaylee, and then came to wake Chris. "You have to go with Dad. He thinks he can do this by himself with just his hunting bow and that axe, but I won't let him go till he takes you with him. Just between here and the creek, we already found 4 dead yearlings. Storm killed them a few days ago, and they have a ton of coyotes, eagles, and crows eating on them." She paused to rub his back as he sat up, rubbing his eyes. "I know it'll be hard on you, but you have to go with him." Chris nodded and went to get his chore coats and boots back on. Outside, he took Dumbledore's hackamore lead and thanked Ada for saddling the horse. As he and his father, along with the 2 stock dogs, rode across the flats and down to the creek, they soon found the carcasses his mother had talked about. His father dismounted to cut the ear tag out of each dead steer. Seeing the coyotes, eagles, and crows that feasted on their yearlings was heartbreaking, also chilling. He could understand his mother's worry. It was almost guaranteed that the wolf pack would claim one of the storm-killed cattle for themselves. By the time they crossed Grass Creek, he already had 5 tags in his pocket. In the distance, they saw a rider trotting towards them on the blacktop. Chris's father said, "I think that's Roland. Go say what he wants." Diverting from their course, they met up with the Emerson kid. As they greeted their friend, a long howl could be heard rising above the valley. 2 dogs raised their hackles at the sound, growling softly at the southern ridge. There, Chris could see one of the wolves, his gray coat outlining the predator easily against the white snow. He said, "Roland, you can't be out here by yourself like this. Wolves are a lot more aggressive than they used to be." Roland petted his pretty little roan mare. "Well, I was just coming to see you guys. It's only 3 miles. Think you and me will be fine for this little trip." He leaned forward in the saddle to peer closely at Chris. "What the hell? What happened to your face, bro?" Chris ran a hand over the blisters lining his cheeks. The ones over his brow were under the heavy wool cap and itched abominably. "I've been sick. Only just started feeling better a couple days ago. These are left over from my fever. Mom says they'll heal up just fine." But really, he knew they wouldn't. Freymatuk had made those marks. They would stay on his face forever. Roland shook his head and said, "Wow, that must have been some fever. Your eyes still look like shit." Chris rubbed his tired eyes and laughed dryly. "Thanks, bud." Bruce pointed at the heavy bow knife scabbarded at their neighbor's waist. I don't see any firearms on you. Did you figure out they ain't working right now? Roland nodded with a small shrug. Tried to shoot one of our cows. She'd gotten down during the storm. None of them tractors are working, so we couldn't even get her up, move her to the barn. Coyotes were gonna get at her. He let his words trail off. Yes, everyone knew that coyotes didn't kill the bigger prey. They would eat them while they were still alive, usually from the back to the front. Chris's father said, That knife ain't gonna be enough. He pointed at the wolf, even now trotting down the ridge. Won't do you much good if you got 5 of those guys coming at you. Instead of addressing Bruce's concern, Roland said, You see where he's dropping down off the ridge? We found your cattle there this morning, along with a small bunch of ours. They were too weak to be sorted, so we brought them all back to the hay pasture. Roland paused and then added, Bruce, I hate to tell you this, but there were only 80 of your steers that was still walking. We counted another 19 that had gotten down in the blizzard. No telling how many are between here and there. Bruce hung his head. With bile in his throat, Chris added the numbers up. So far, they knew that 24 of their 40 yearlings had been killed. It was likely that the other 8 were also laid out on the valley bottom somewhere. His family's dreams of getting started raising cattle had been lost in the blizzard. Sitting his good roan mare, his father put a hand over his eyes. His deep sob turned into a frustrated growl. Chris sidled his horse closer and put a comforting hand on his father's shoulder. He struggled to keep his mind clear as a weird fog descended over him. With intense effort, he fought the visions of his dream away. This was not the time to start spouting prophecies of doom and gloom. The terrible blizzard was only the first blow they would have to endure. More than just the cattle producers faced a grim future. After a few moments, Roland said, Dad wants to know if you guys come over tomorrow morning and help us feed ours. We don't have a working vehicle on the place. Chris's father lifted his head and turned his horse towards the Emerson ranch. Yeah, of course. We just got to get a couple of bales into the horses first, but then we'll be over. He took a trot up the blacktop and turned towards the Emerson's place. With a glance at another wolf trotting off the ridge to the spot where all those carcasses lay, he said, Come on, we'll get you most of the way home, Roland. It's not safe to be out here with just a little bitty knife. They brought Roland to the edges of his family's hayfields, then turned back towards their own home. They covered the distance in silence. Chris knew his father was struggling with the devastating loss of their little starting herd, but he also knew it didn't really matter. Everything would have to be started over now, and people would have to learn to live with a different reality.
This is Camon, reading Wyoming, Tarins Rising. The electricity fails. This was a story from the Wyoming Tarin Rising series. If you've listened this far, you owe us a like, and if you enjoyed it, you should subscribe as well. The story was narrated by Camon Rain and is written by Ashakery Dart. Check for updates coming up soon, and be sure to subscribe.